Hello, and welcome to the Massachusetts premiere showing of our video documentary, A House Built by Hope, a story of compassion, resilience, and religious freedom. I am Demetria Shabazz, a board member of Amherst Media. The video you are about to see is the fruit and labor of love by our dear friend Elsie Fetterman, the families of the Temple Beth Israel, and our talented and dedicated staff of Amherst Media. This video's narrative is based upon Holocaust survivor stories as told through the eyes of their children. Many of these families were relocated during the post-World War II years to Danielson, Connecticut, and its immediate vicinity. The story is about survival, adjustment, and resettlement, but even more about how a Christian community received these families and helped them to start their new lives. It looks at the efforts undertaken to build their house of worship, Temple Beth Israel, and the support they were given. In these troubling times when we have seen immigrant families torn apart and publicly vilified, it is important to see how one community's different approach, one comprised of acceptance and assistance, resulted in a lasting collaborative and mutually supportive community. This 35-minute video will be followed by a panel discussion on the issues raised within the video. Panelists include Hampshire College history professor Jim Wald, Department Chair Social Studies at Amherst Pelham Regional High School, Simon Lutz, and Dr. Elsie Fetterman, former Danielson resident and member of the Temple Beth Israel Preservation Society. And now, the show.
Here is the story of a temple from 1950 built by Holocaust survivors and a few Americans.
I remember my mother saying, "Where have you brought me?" All that was around her were tall grasses and fields, and it was a very hard life.
We knew people here who had tattoos on their arms and knew the stories of them surviving death camps.
Coming here when I was a little boy, and all these Holocaust survivor farmers, they didn't have a cantor or a rabbi really, and they all took turns, chanting. It was something to see. It really was.
The people were able to come alive again after the war, especially the immigrants, the Holocaust survivors.
I remember my mom talking about people coming up to her and handing her $1. This is for the temple.
You've heard stories of folks who donated some of their livestock to be able to help raise money because they didn't have money directly, that were not Jewish. That's phenomenal.
This synagogue, I think, is a testament to the community. It needed a community to make this thing occur.
So we came here, found a beautiful reception, a welcoming congregation, and then found out all the stories about what we heard, who they were, where they came from. After World War II, when the significance of the Holocaust was discovered and realized that there were people in the internment camps that were coming to this country, they settled in major cities and didn't have anything to do. And the Hirsch Foundation, Baron Hirsch, had opened up agricultural land, and that's when the families came here, mainly from cities, and became part of the area in northeast Connecticut. And there were families that are here whose parents and grandparents were so grateful to what they did, they helped settle them.
My father was born in Kozlo, Poland, and he was invited when he was the age of 14 to go live with his uncle who lived in Sosnovich to learn a trade, because my My father's uncle was a tinsmith, a welder, basically. And he left the home and he went to Sosnovich to learn his trade, and that's probably what saved his life in the war, because once they found out he could do that, they put him in the work camps. And he was actually in at least 6 work camps.
My mother was born in Minsk, in Russia. My father was from Poland, Baranovich area. My father was the leader of a partisan group during the war. That's where he met my mother, actually, was in the woods in Poland. And my father had lost his first wife and son in the Holocaust. And my mother had lost her first husband and 2 sons in the Holocaust.
My father was born and raised in a southeastern suburb of Warsaw in Siedlec, Poland, and he was able to get to the Partisans through walking and roaming through the woods for 3 weeks after his town had experienced 3 roundups. My mother was raised in the city. She was in what is now Belarus and the town of Baranovich, and she was able to find her way to this group in the woods. She was part of the family organization of the group. My father went between the family and the fighter organization of the group, and they met in the woods. And as the story my father would say is, he needed somebody to cook for him, and my mother had a pot. So coupling in this way, which was not particularly romantic, but out of necessity, happened with great frequency.
And my mother was from a small town in Poland. It was called Janov Poleski. And as a matter of fact, my mother's town, they were invaded twice, and they killed off the entire Jewish population except for my mother. She was left with a lot of scars, physical and mental, emotional. She walked around for the rest of her life with a bullet in her lung. My father, he went off on his own, and he just started trying to protect the town, and he joined the Partisans and all these different groups that were trying to survive the Holocaust. Both of them were in the woods. My mother was bleeding, and my father rescued her. He saved her from bleeding to death, and he nursed her back to health, and they hid in the woods.
What a lot of people don't know that my dad told me is that the Nazis had made plans to exterminate everybody at Buchenwald days before Patton came in. The inmates took over the camp, they assassinated a lot of the Nazi guards, and they were waiting with open arms for Patton to come in.
My dad volunteered to fight in World War II, and he was inducted and soon became a sharpshooter. He arrived in Normandy about a month after the invasion. He was part of the 4th Armored Division, and it was that division that went into the Battle of the Bulge. And then, as we found out years later, that it was also the 4th Armored Division that discovered the very first concentration camp and liberated that camp, what was left of it. After he had passed away, we found out that he had his share of run-ins with people that gave him a hard time about being Jewish, but the one thing that we also learned was that if you were a soldier, everyone was fighting the same enemy. Everybody was watching each other's backs. So whatever else happened, they were able to separate that out from who the enemy was.
My father was actually in at least 6 work camps before the final camp, which was Allach, which was a sub-camp of Dachau. And at that point, he was ill. He had some sort of typhus, a fever. His weight was dropping. He was only about 90 pounds at that point. And I think if he had been there another week, he would have been dead. And that's what he says. But he was liberated. He calls that his birthday. His date of liberation was his birthday.
My dad never talked about the war when we were kids. We knew that he had nightmares often of the war, but there was never any open conversations or discussions.
The nightmares that he would have from what he saw when he liberated the camp
was one of the liberators in the camp. You know, nobody should ever have to go through that, just as nobody should ever have to go through what the survivors went through.
My dad was a really tough guy. He grew up in Providence. He was a Renaissance man in many ways. He played in the Rhode Island Junior Philharmonic. He played violin. He was a wrestler. He was a boxer. He was a very good boxer. He was a Depression-era born kid who grew up by his bootstraps. It was years later after he died that one of the survivors, who was a member of the congregation here, his name was Herman Shepard, he told me about my dad's service during the war, and from what I understand, my dad confided in him at the time about his being part of the unit that discovered the first camp and the horrors of what it was that they found. And that was when I first started beginning to understand why so many of the survivors had this connection with my dad and some of the other soldiers that were part of the congregation.
I think the fact that the founders were veterans and also Holocaust survivors, and they were part of the community. We knew people here who had tattoos on their arms and knew the stories of them surviving death camps. And as a small child, my father would tell me where he had a key for a safety deposit box. He also told me where he kept, some money stashed in the basement rafters. And I used to think he was a paranoid man. But to me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, World War II was ancient history. To him, it was fresh in his mind, and it could happen again. So I think that made this temple and this congregation and even my generation that followed those who founded it, keenly aware that it's a legacy and a lesson worth preserving.
So it's sort of interesting about my dad's suitcase. He has his original name on there, which is Chaim Shapurka, which is his Jewish Polish name. My father gave me that suitcase a number of years ago and said, "This is a suitcase that I brought to America." And he came here alone as a young man with all his hopes and all his dreams. And that suitcase really represents everything that he had, all his potential, all his dreams about the Golden Medina, that land filled with milk and honey, an opportunity to be something, not to be spat upon or crucified because you were a Jew, a better place, a good place. But that suitcase was everything that he had in this world, and he kept it all these years.
My mother decided that she did not want to go to Palestine, which was ironic given that she was so Zionistic. And they were sponsored by a family member, and they came through Ellis Island, New Year's Day of 1951. Then they found through one of the members of their partisan group lived on the state line of Connecticut and Rhode Island, and they went to visit them. And at that point, the friend, Lazar Siegel, of blessed memory, said to my dad, also of blessed memory, "You know, if you come and become a wholesale egg farmer like me, you can live an independent life." So my parents came to Foster, Rhode Island, where they bought a small farm. And I remember my mother saying, "Where have you brought me?" All that was around her were tall grasses and fields, and it was a very hard life.
My parents were David and Shirley Rosenberg, and they were founders of Temple Beth Israel. My mom came from New Bedford, Mass, and my dad came from Providence, Rhode Island. And after the war in 1950, they decided on settling in Danielson to raise a family, to start a family business, which is still here today, Danielson Surplus Sales. And our family has had an unbroken connection to this community now for the past 67 years.
It wasn't until 1950 when Holocaust survivors started to buy chicken farms. They got funding from the Jewish Agricultural Society. They really never discussed their experiences, but looking back now, to think that they were ready to start a brand new life, start a family, help building this temple, which is now in the Connecticut and the National Registers of Historic Places. And the community spirit, as people say, Yankee country, they welcomed the Holocaust survivors with open arms.
And it was a rural life, growing up on a chicken farm. And what was interesting was the camaraderie and the cohesiveness of the chicken farmers and the Jewish chicken farmers, who really helped build the temple and build the community. You know the term, it takes a village? And that's really what the community was like. It was a village, and everybody looked out for everyone else. And the people were able to come alive again after the war, especially the immigrants, the Holocaust survivors. And so it was, looking back on it, it was a very interesting dynamic of how they came together, and they really became everyone's extended family because the people had lost so many people in the Holocaust.
When my father came in 1952, they found this farm in Plainfield, but they were $500 short for the purchase price. And he called his lawyer in Norwich, it was Milton Jacobson. Milton called up his friend C. Stanton Gallup. He told Mr. Gallup the story of my father, how he was a Holocaust survivor, wanted to come to Plainfield and buy this farm. C. Stanton Gallup went to his church, had a collection and on it, to help my father, and he got the $500 from the Baptist church.
Dad was very entrepreneurial and went into a lot of businesses, but farming was a little bit easier. He didn't want to be in the city. He'd been crowded in the concentration camps. He'd been in the bunks sleeping with 5 people across, so he was a little bit claustrophobic. He wanted open air. He didn't want to sit inside a factory.
My parents came over on the USS Ernie Pyle into New York, and Dad went to work in the sweatshops there. And he heard about this program called the Jewish Agricultural Society, a fellow named Benjamin Miller. So they went to see what it was like, and they took a ride out here to Eastern Connecticut. They were one of the first actually to come to this area. They were the early ones.
I grew up on a dairy farm, a pretty good size operation. My father had built it up, having started the farm. We were milking about 150 head at its peak. In the summertime when we didn't have school, we would help with the haying. My sisters, one of them would help my mother raise the calves. Another one did mostly work in the house. We all chipped in, did what we could.
We actually had 52 acres of land. We had some land in Rhode Island, some in Connecticut. And it had about 5,000 chickens. In '57, he built another coop on the Connecticut side. And then after that, he built another addition to that coop and a new house in Connecticut. And by the end, he had over 20,000 chickens. So he made a pretty good living.
At one point, my father installed a milking parlor, which was very high-tech for its day. He did certain things with conservation in his fields, and he actually won an award. I think it was in 1967, he was named the Conservation Farmer of the Year in Windham County. I mean, not a big deal in Windham County, but that's a big deal for somebody who really wasn't a farmer.
As the congregation grew in size and the farmers would come together, much like Sunday church you see on TV in the old shows in the Midwest, that type of thing, they came together and it was a gathering place. And so services were going on, but they were always talking about chickens and the health of the chickens.
These guys come to a new country. They learn the country's language. They don't ask the country to learn their language. They say, we're going to learn yours. Number 2 is, what was their education by the time the war hit? 5th grade, 4th grade, 6th grade? Now you come to a different country with a different language and you run a business? Think about that. And you're successful in a business? That's mind-boggling.
Well, we did have Friday night services at home, And within a 35-mile radius, there might be 10 Jewish men. And the old days, the Orthodox, they only count men as part of their minion 10, but now we count 10 women are equal, and so they're counted. So I used to have to go and knock on doors and everything for the holidays, and we had them at our house, the services. My father and mother had brought a Torah back from Norwich.
Over time, they were meeting and having services and high holidays, you know, in somebody's house, and they all decided that they should, you know, get together and maybe we'll build our own synagogue.
My grandparents were not refugees, my mother's parents, but they were, I believe, the only Jews in town, so they also needed a place to worship along with all the refugees that came from Europe. So and they all came together along with non-Jewish business people to help to make it happen. And fast forward to today, I think that if people could all get along that well, then it would be absolutely wonderful.
My husband was very involved. He bought the land, and the people who owned the land said, we have 2 parcels, we're not selling one without the other. So my husband bought both parcels, so just one to the temple, and then we had one which we later sold when we moved away from Danielson.
I remember my mom talking about people coming up to her, because she would work in the store with my dad, or if she was on the street, and handing her $1. This is for the temple.
So in the late 40s, when the synagogue movement to have it built came together, my grandfather decided it would be a good idea to donate a calf. And at the auction, that was a livestock auction that took place in Middletown. And so as the story goes, the calf probably would have produced $25, $30, $35 would have been a market value in those days. And Mr. Cohn purchased it for $65 that day, which was a large sum, and it got a little bit of buzz, and there was a little bit of media.
What's nice about that, aside from it being a nice story, is that it imprints in, when I was a child, people like me, that you are sort of beholden to a larger population, and that we can all help each other out. It's not a matter of just helping in one silo, this group or that group or whatever, but you have a larger sense of responsibility because other people have helped you, or folks before you that have helped create, in this case, the synagogue.
It could not have been built just by Jewish money, and it couldn't have just been built by those that were here originally or those survivors that came in. It needed a community to make this thing occur.
And what was stunning was that the churches, the banks, the community centers, the civic leaders, the school, I mean, everybody said, what a great idea. There are these immigrants, they're just off the boat, and we're going to help them. We'll give them money. We'll give them loans, we will welcome them. A stunning contrast, I think, to what we're encountering these days. I mean, especially for me and if my parents were alive today, they would say, oh my God, isn't this different from how we were received?
We have a wonderful editorial written about my mother and how, even though she was Orthodox, how she was so acceptant of everyone and put herself out. And my father became, he was a World War I veteran, and he was commander of the American Legion, and they got the first ambulance, and he was president of the Danielson Industrial Foundation, and he was on the Day-Kilmer Hospital Board of Trustees, he was on the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, you name it, his name as chair.
He had a life here at the synagogue, but he also had a life in the town of Plainfield. He became very involved in politics. He was on the town Democratic Committee. And because he was on the town Democratic Committee, he wanted my mother to be on the town Democratic Committee. So she joined, she came along for the ride. He became a member of the finance board, the Board of Finance. They set the budgets every year for the town. He became a member of 2 school building committees. He would go visit the legislators and probably lobbied for whatever
A list of all the organizations my father had joined, is like a shopping list. It's just, blood drives, Lions Club, I forgot it was a Rotary or the Elks Club. So he joined a lot of civic organizations, professional organizations, served at the temple, I think, in at least a half a dozen positions.
My father was much more interested in the outside world. He had many American friends, made a lot of friends in the outside community, and really straddled both worlds. His father was active in the community and acted as a cantor for the prisoners, for the Jewish prisoners, was very active in the orphanage and was well known in the community. And my dad really took after him because when he came to America, he had the same sort of attitude. Very close to the VFW, very close to the veterans, raised a lot of money for them, worked with them, and actually before he became ill, wanted to set up some specialized housing for the veterans because they were so special to him.
My parents, as I mentioned, were showing the signs of the trauma. I mean, there was a lot of quiet time. There was a lot of, just silence. There were a lot of empty spaces. And so to come out of that suddenly, the word was, oh, we're going to the temple. What's the temple? I have no idea. And I come to this place where I hear for the first time other people speaking Yiddish. And I hear laughter, and I hear energy, and I hear animation. And then I see my parents engaged with the other people. So for me, it was stunning. It was like, oh, there can be another kind of life. There can be another kind of experience that's not this silent, isolated, hunkered down, sad experience.
There's something about this place that just calls you back. It's here, but it's here.
Growing up in that synagogue was very different than growing up in other synagogues. We did not have a rabbi who supported us, but so many of the people who were immigrated from Eastern Europe knew Hebrew very well and were very learned. And so it was a lay leadership. It was always that environment of, camaraderie and caring for each other.
I remember the unbelievably wonderful scents and smells of the women cooking in the kitchen. And it's a small kitchen, didn't matter. Setting things up for various events that were going on here. My mom was very involved with the sisterhood. My mother was secretary for a number of years, and they did all sorts of activities. They did fashion shows, they did hat shows, they did lessons, not necessarily as a sisterhood, but as a group of women who were interested in painting. They would go together and have paintings done. As a matter of fact, the Tree of Life that was done by, I believe her name is Alida Crisella, she was the teacher. And there's a number of pieces of art here that she had done.
My father started this interfaith Thanksgiving dinner and prayer service 60 years ago, and it has been meeting continually since that time, and I didn't know that. I knew he did that years ago, but that's his legacy, to reach out to these other faith communities, because he really firmly believed that building these bridges is essential for our people to live in harmony.
I love the actual architecture of the synagogue because it's partially modern, and that's part of what got it into the registry, but also it has classic sort of homey features of stone and wood that make you feel at home. And yet, it is modern and progressive. You're moving forward. There's plenty of glass, so you feel openness at the same time. It's an archway. You feel a cathedral component, which you feel spiritual in that regard. But it is warm and inviting, which I think is fantastic, rather than imposing or overwhelming. I think the nature of the architecture, probably why it won a number of different awards, etc., is that. It combines the history and the culture with a sense of moving forward.
It's a community that at its height had 70 families. It had a functioning Hebrew school. It had a very active social calendar. So it was a real community center because within a fairly close radius, you had many, many Jewish people who were members. Now you've got 3 or 4 families that are in the area. And so how do you do a Jewish community without Jews?
But they all said they were going to come.
They sent me, in response again to the Yisker book,
We were down to just a handful of families. Now as adults, we understood the importance of saving the history and passing it on to future generations, and not just Jewish families, but the greater interfaith community.
We needed to save the building. We needed to ensure that this building was here. And Joel just got the ball rolling.
I reached out to a group of families who grew up here, along with other friends in the area who had moved to this area years later.
People drove in. People drove in from Massachusetts, from Rhode Island, from other parts of Connecticut, and we met.
And through a series of heart-to-heart conversations about the reality of would we be able to, save this synagogue? Would it be a congregation in the future, or would it be something else? And ultimately, from across the country, and including Israel, we were able to put together a group of about 20 individuals who agreed that if we formed a new nonprofit as a historical preservation society, that in fact we would be able to save this building. We would be able to tell the stories of the old congregation, but just as important, we would be able to have a new cause to teach lessons about the Holocaust and to try to educate children and adults about the importance of learning how to live together.
It still has a role to play in history. My mom helped get it into the National Registry, no accident. Part of it was the architecture, part of it was that it was a home for Holocaust survivors, but it is something larger. Whether it's something spiritual, whatever you want to call it, there's something that draws you to it because it had such an imprint on you. And you know it's something you need to contribute to keep that spirit alive, to help others.
One of the mandates in Jewish tradition is tikkun olam, repair the world. It's part of each Jew's responsibility to actually go out and try to make life better for people around it, for the community, for the world at large. So if that building can become a place where that lesson is taught, and then every now and then we can say, by the way, we got this from the founders. There's a history of the Holocaust here. There's a history of what happens when you don't try to repair the world. What happens, what are the consequences when you don't step up, when you don't speak out, when you see something bad happening?
Everett Wendo's mom, Ray, is 102 years old, and she was giving talks. She went to schools. She would be an active participant in what was going on with the Preservation Society. So, you don't want to let people like that down. You want to keep going. You want to say, yes, okay, we can do this. We can make sure that it continues.
So I see it more and more as ecumenical, a wonderful building, a wonderful story to be told. Working together, whether it's your immediate family, the community, the state, the nation, working together to help support each other, what each other needs. I think that's critical, and being concerned about others, about other people's problems.
It's our responsibility to try and maintain both educating other people and new generations of folks to learn about not only our experience as being children of Holocaust survivors, but also what a community does to accept other people.
For those of us that grew up in this synagogue, our parents would be incredibly proud of what we've carried on. It's no longer a congregation, but they'd be proud of what we're doing in trying to promote tolerance. And I think they'd be pleased to know that the synagogue doors are still open a few times a year, and that our message is as relevant today as it was when they first built this synagogue.
Now that most of those survivors are gone, and there's a handful left, somebody's got to tell the story, especially with what goes on in the world today. Somebody's got to tell the story.
If we can have something, call it a museum, call it an educational site, call it whatever, but a place where this history is known and people go, wow, look at these pictures, look at this, huh. And if it just gets one person to think, then we've done well. We've done well.
Welcome to this special broadcast by Amherst Media of a documentary about a very special building and congregation in Danielson, Connecticut. My name is Jim Wald, and I teach history at Hampshire College. Actually, I'm also teaching the Holocaust course at UMass this semester. And I'm joined here by Simon Lutz, who teaches the Holocaust and other subjects at Amherst Regional High School, and by Elsie Fetterman, who was really the driving force behind this whole film, as you will soon find out, from telling the story of the building to making the film happen to preserving all the records of this wonderful story. And in opening, I just wanted to say a few words about the topic and its larger context. It's a story of a community of Holocaust survivors that came, perhaps unexpectedly, to rural Connecticut and established themselves there in a largely agricultural system of business and community making. And when we think about Holocaust survivors, it's interesting to think about what we're actually talking about. You know, there's several categories. There are really two big different types of survivors. In the beginning, it was mostly survivors from what was called Greater Germany, that is the old German state, Austria, which it absorbed, and the portions of Czechoslovakia, modern Czech Republic, that it absorbed. And for a variety of reasons, people were able to escape from there in fairly large numbers. For example, about a third of the German Jews were able to, half the German Jews were able to immigrate before the war began. And this is in part because, after all, you know, when we immigrate, you've got to understand there's a need. You have to have the opportunity to leave, and you have to have some place to go. And immigration was difficult because there were a few places to go, and there were restrictive immigration policies. The US had very ethnocentric policies that kept out people from parts of Europe. Palestine was largely closed to immigration because of the British mandatory policies in that period and so forth. And yet, nonetheless, approximately 475,000 or so Jews escaped from Greater Germany. Some of those ended up, of course, in countries that were later absorbed by the Nazis once again, about 150,000, but still a lot came here. But after 1938, really, it became almost impossible to immigrate. I mean, the Nazi policy before that had been to push the Jews out, to strip them of their wealth, to send them somewhere else, which both got rid of them and made them a burden for anybody who wanted to take them, which politicized the issue very nicely as far as they were concerned. In 1938, the Kristallnacht, the so-called Night of Broken Glass, with the pogroms which involved attacks on Jewish property and synagogues, communal offices, and large numbers of arrests, really marked the turning point. At that point, it was very hard to get out afterwards. You were more likely sent to a concentration camp. than not, or if you were, you didn't get out. You weren't sent there as a sort of a lesson and let back out, as an example. This was a huge turning point. Then, of course, the beginning of the war in September 1939 is the next turning point. And then between 39 and 1941, the Nazis really officially ban all immigration. And so that means a very different situation, which affects both who's able to leave and who stays and what happens to them. So, for example, whereas roughly half the German Jews were able to get out, over 90% of the Polish Jews were exterminated. And so at the end of the war, if we ask who the Holocaust survivors are, they are mostly people who came from Eastern Europe or East Central Europe, from Poland, Soviet Union, other areas in that part of the world. And after the war, then you had numbers of so-called displaced persons, both Jewish. There are massive movements of population, people who survived, prisoners of war, ethnic Germans who were expelled, people who were fleeing one system of government or another. And so you had a massive problem of displaced persons, as they called them, or stateless persons in Europe at the end of the war, who had to be taken care of. And so at the end of this, there were several hundred thousand in Western Europe alone. And one thing that happened in the United States was that in light of the tragedy of the Holocaust and the general chaos in World War II, the United States decided to relax the immigration policies and allow displaced persons to come to the States. And so at the end of 1945, the quotas allowed 41,000 DPs to come, 28,000 were Jews. And then finally in 1948, Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, which saw 400,000 visas for displaced persons from 49 through 52. And so that really brought a large change in the immigration policy as a whole, and it affected the character of the immigrants. And I think one of the things that's interesting to consider in this case also is, the nature of where they're coming. People went to different places. Again, in general, they were supposed to have some kind of means of support, someone who would vouch for them. I mean, there were assistance programs, but there were a major attempt to try to get people settled in places. So some people found jobs, some found sponsors on farms, some found scholarships and so forth. It varied widely. And in the case of Danielson, Connecticut, we have the very unusual story of Holocaust survivors who mostly came from Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia, Soviet Union. People who came from largely urban backgrounds, as the film points out, who came to this small rural community and began to work largely in agriculture, in cattle farming and chicken farming and so forth. The film alludes, for example, to the Baron Hirsch Fund. There was Baron Maurice de Hirsch, a major philanthropist in the late 19th century. And one of the things that he did at 1889, 1880s and following was to try to find some way to help the Jews of Eastern Europe who were suffering under anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire, the famous pogroms and so forth that helped also to lead to immigration to the US. And so one of Hirsch's initiatives was to try to resettle people and retrain them for life in the New World with an emphasis on agriculture and trades. And you'll see mentioned in the film of the Hirsch Fund and the Jewish Agricultural Society, which helped to bring people here. It's also interesting to think about the places they came. For example, we live in so much more of a multicultural world now, whatever its flaws and limits, but it's hard to imagine how isolated life was back then in certain ways. People Americans didn't have the experience of the world, whether through travel or through mass media, the way that we do. Communities were much more homogeneous ethnically and culturally and so forth. Amherst had no Jews till 1904, for example. Jews tended to go to towns that had markets or some kind of business activity, like a Northampton, a county seat in Massachusetts. Rural towns in Western Massachusetts or Connecticut were something quite different. And so it really was quite a striking thing that these Holocaust survivors, some of them are survivors of the camps, some of them survivors of the partisans and resistance, which is a whole story in itself that needs to be told and will be told as this project goes on, that they came to Connecticut and they founded a congregation and they found a community and they were welcomed. And we have more to say about that later, but I think maybe then I should turn this over to Elsie, who was the driving force behind the whole thing, as I said. And again, Elsie's position is different. If I understand it, you grew up in this community, but your parents were already American, your grandparents had been there at least and so forth. And so you were a sort of a rarity in that part of Connecticut, but still coming from a very different place than these survivors. Could you tell us a little bit about the origins of the story, Elsie, I know over the years you've talked with great passion about why you felt the story had to be told.
Well, I was born and brought up in Danielson, and my parents we were the only Jewish family in the community. And that was in 1924. And my parents were both in Norwich, Connecticut, which is about 25 miles away. But my father had an opportunity to buy a hardware store in Danielson, Connecticut. But what's interesting is they both came from very, very religious families in Norwich, Orthodox families. My mother kept a kosher home, and we get the kosher meat on a bus from Norwich. There was a bus from Norwich to Danielson, 25 miles away. And so we were used to, but my mother always opened our home to Christians at Passover time and everything. And we would bring matzah to school to show the students. So in 1950, we had about 40 Holocaust families that came. First time we had a few Jewish business people, and for the holidays, and I could never get perfect attendance. And to this day, I'm 93, and I'm upset that I could never get perfect attendance certificate from school, because the only time I was out were the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. My father would have the store closed. Everybody would know that it's Rosh Hashanah. We never hit it. And the newspaper, when my mother died, wrote a beautiful article. And so it's interesting. However, I used to have to knock on doors for the holidays. There were about 10 Jewish families within a 35, 40 mile radius to get people to come and have a service. And for bar mitzvahs, they have a big deal today about bar mitzvahs, but I have 4 brothers. They were bar mitzvahs in our home at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they had some whiskey and challah bread and herring, because the 10 men, they didn't count women in those days, the 10 men had to open up their businesses. So bar mitzvah, you become a man, and they didn't believe in women having bar mitzvahs. So life was very, very different. But when we had 40 families in 1950 on that came, who were Holocaust survivors, and through the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society. So we felt it was time that we needed a synagogue. And so what happened, we formed a sisterhood, and I became president of the sisterhood, and my husband and my father, we were all very active. And my daughter Vita's the first wedding there, and my brother Maya, the first bar mitzvah. So I originally went to see Jim at Amherst Media because my granddaughter videotaped some of the people who I wanted to preserve the story. And when I told Jim the story, he said, "You've got to do, this is a story for the world to see, for the whole world. Everybody should see it. He said, we have 2,200 sister brother networks that we can get this out to." So I wrote a grant to the DAR. I had gotten one grant already for the temple, and we got that one to do the documentary. That one was to do the patio. We needed a lot of work. We are now in the National Register of Historic Places, and even though there are 50 or 60 Jewish families at its height, there are less than 3 families. And what's exciting to me is we are more of an ecumenical group now. And I think in this time right now that we ought to take a look at Passover. We've had a Thanksgiving service for over 60 years. 100 people come, 20 Jews at most, and 80 Christians. And at Thanksgiving, interfaith service, Passover Seder, we still observe them. So it's a story to be told. And Simon can tell you how I approached him at high school. But even I just feel, especially now with what's happened in the world, to take a look at Danielson, even now, Danielson, Connecticut, how people, so I do
I'm very passionate about this story be told for the whole world to see how we are all, how people are still getting along in this little small community. 5,000 people in Danielson.
That's wonderful. I had a couple of questions that occurred to me while watching the film and listening to you here. Some of them about the people and some about the building. So for the people, I guess I had two questions. One, what was it like for you to meet these people? Again, we're living in a very different world nowadays with constant media coverage of everything. And people knew about the Holocaust in certain terms, but not in detail. There's mention in the film that one of these people, an American father, was in the 4th Armored Division, which liberated Ordruf concentration camp, which was the first the Americans found, a subcamp of Buchenwald in April 45. So I think we tend to assume that people knew more about the Holocaust then than they actually did. And I guess one question for you was, what was it like to meet these people? What did you expect of them? What did they expect of you? And the other one I had was, you speak almost as if it's a natural thing. We have more Jews, we have to build a synagogue. Was there a desire for that on the part of the immigrants or the part of the locals who wanted to bring them into the community? How did that work?
We never hired a rabbi, never had a rabbi, because they were so well learned. And I forgot to tell you that my father had a Torah in Norwich and he brought it to Danielson. And so when I would round up all these men and we would have services in our own home on Winter Street in Danielson, where I was born, brought up. And so, but they never talked about the Holocaust. Ray Galindo, and you'll see a picture of her, she was giving talks. She didn't talk about it to her own family until she was 91 years old. They didn't talk, they did not discuss it. They didn't talk about it at all. And then it came out one day that about the Holocaust, and you'll see my son's there. He wanted to know what were those numbers on their arms, and so it's interesting. As president of the sisterhood, I always would lead the members in the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star Spangled Banner, and very meekly, one of the Holocaust survivors, her name is Anna Israel, she was a Hebrew teacher. She came up to me very quietly and said, "Elsie, do you think we could sing the national anthem, Hatikva, for Israel?" And I said, "Anna, I don't know the words. If you tell me what the words are, I'll type them up." We didn't have the email. This is 1950. I said, "You type them up and we'll sing Hatikva." And the other thing is that my mother and father did not observe all the holidays. They observed Passover and the high holidays, but I didn't know about Shavuos and I didn't know about Sukkot. So the other thing they asked me as president, "Don't you think we could observe some of these holidays?" And I said, "Well, tell me what they are. We'll have committees and we'll observe all of them." So we only had 8 people in the sisterhood to begin with, but then with the Holocaust survivors, more people came. And so we had a committee for every one of the holidays. So because my mother and father were both in the hardware store, very hardworking. As anyone who owns the business, sole proprietor, you've got to be everything. And matter of fact, they had me working there at 7 years old, learning how to do accounts receivable and accounts payable. And my father wanted me to stay in the store. He said, "Oh, you're really good in the hardware store." So they did, and I'm one of 6 children, so there wasn't a lot of time. So I didn't even know about all the other holidays, and so it was a whole new world for me. And now my oldest daughter, Vida, is in Israel, and she became very Orthodox. She won't answer the telephone on a Saturday. She won't, but she has milk and meat when she comes here. She has all her own dishes and everything. But it was a whole new learning experience about what is it being Jewish? What is that about? What are the holidays? And it was a whole new life for me, but they never talked about the Holocaust in the 1950s.
That's interesting. So in other words, all the parties were learning from each other. The Jews who lived there learned from the immigrants and sort of the larger community. maybe I'll hold off on my question about the building and turn things over to Simon, because I know that Simon and I both have an interest in teaching about this period of history, but also he's done some really important work in Amherst High School addressing the larger social questions and what we can learn from this film with the curriculum he's developing. You know, one thing that occurred to me, I don't know, we didn't talk about this before, Simon. You did mention this in your very eloquent remarks in the Gazette article some years back. You know, I think that very much with us today, as we see in the film and the comments of some of the participants, are these questions of nativism versus inclusivity. Are we welcoming to immigrants, diversity, and so forth? And you pointed out there, and you know, you and I both know all too well, that the United States was not always the most welcoming, from the immigration restrictions of the 1920s to just general attitudes. You know, you could still put ads in the New York Times in the 1930s and 40s, you know, hiring a secretary that we're expecting a Gentile woman and not a Jewish woman and so forth. You know, this was commonplace. I mean, even, you know, the other thing is that in several countries, it's been said in both Britain and the United States, there were apparently rises of anti-Semitism during the war in certain categories. So for example, if you look at opinion polls, you know, in 1939, you know, 40% of Americans think Jews have excessive power. This continues through the war. Jews were feared as an immigrant group or as sort of a divisive element, in part because they were unknown. You know, I thought this was the thing I hadn't mentioned before. I don't know if you know it. There's a wonderful sort of quasi-documentary, reconstructed documentary, fictional documentary, or propaganda film produced by the Office of War Information called The Cummington Story. It's about Cummington in Western Mass, made in 1945 by OWI, and it's about how this little town, led by its minister, absorbed a lot of European refugees, you know, and it really shows you the process whereby these people come here and neither group knows how to talk to the other or what to expect. And gradually the barriers break down, they become integrated, they find common interests and so forth. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see using this in the curriculum, whether to teach the Holocaust or larger issues of pluralism of the type.
Sure. Yeah, when Elsie approached me about working on the project and shared with me the documentary, and I had a chance to watch it, that's immediately what struck me, is sort of living in this moment in time of increasing nativism and anti-immigrant sort of sentiment on the rise. That here was a powerful story of a community taking a very, very different path. There's a concept in Holocaust education called universe of obligation, right? That we should think about where we define that universe sort of sitting, right? Like, who are the people that we have the strongest sort of obligations or responsibility to in our lives? And there's an exercise where I actually ask students to sort of think about the sort of concentric circles and where that universe sort of, where they sort of draw the boundaries of their universe of obligation. And it really struck me that here in this story of Danielson and the temple, that we have a community that really defined its universe broadly. And that a central question really that we could use the film to ask and ask students to think about is, how do we expand that universe of obligation? How do we create a world in which people that we might at first think are very different than ourselves, or a threat, or outsiders that might really change the sort of nature and character of our communities, how do we expand our universe of obligation to integrate them and find a place for people that might not, at least on the surface, seem like us, to find a home? And that's I think that this story tells that incredibly beautifully. And I think that it ties into another thing I really think is a critical element of Holocaust education. I was reading an article maybe about a month ago, sort of, refreshing myself and sort of revisiting, the purpose core, what really sort of should vitalize Holocaust education. And one of the things that, it reminded me was that the opportunity to sort of build empathy with people that might be different than you. In what I love about teaching the course that I teach on the Holocaust, and I'm sure this is the case with others, is just sort of embedding these really deep and powerful personal stories into that teaching of the experiences of people, to see victims of the Holocaust, and in this case survivors of the Holocaust, not just as numbers or figures, right, but instead as fully fledged, in the round, three-dimensional human beings that we can find connection to and deep empathy with. And this seems like in the course that I teach as a sort of one of the closing stories in the sort of closing chapters in the story of the Holocaust that I want to share with kids. This is another opportunity to sort of see, in this case, survivors as fully, three-dimensional human beings wrestling with the pain and trauma. I love how the film talks about that, the pain and trauma. This isn't just a happy story, right? The pain and trauma that people were still obviously wrestling with. But then this finding a community that in sort of a small d democratic ways really embraced them. And like I said, was able to define this universe of obligation broadly and integrate these people into the civic life of the community and integrate them into obviously giving them a religious home and a structure to support that and helping people rebuild and restart their lives again. So like I said, what I really want to center, in terms of teaching around this film is that, confronting students with that question, how do you expand your universe of obligation to include others that might not seem, at least on the surface, immediately like you? And how do we build deep empathy for people that are not like us so that we can expand that universe of obligation and, sort of have them think about what happened in Danielson to make that possible, and what can you do in your own lives and your own communities to make that possible as well.
Mm-hmm. I think we were probably all struck by the image of somebody walking down the street and putting a dollar bill in somebody's hand, or the auction of the livestock and so forth. Really quite striking. Again, it's a story I had no idea about.
Yeah, and I was reminded too in viewing it again, there's a story earlier in the film too about a collection that went up at someone's church to help one of the survivors buy the farm as well. So, it wasn't just in the building of the church, it was helping people get into, a foundation, a foothold in a new business and a new life in the community as well.
Not only was it the Baptist church, but they let the Holocaust survivor borrow $500, knowing this Holocaust survivor had no experience whatsoever in farming. So it wasn't only that, but I thought about an experience, Simon, as you were talking about trying to expand and I walk in somebody else's shoes. I was at the University of Connecticut and worked with all the community action agencies, and we would meet, heads of consumer education would meet at different offices, and they were going to meet they wanted to meet in Willimantic stores. And I said, well, I live in Mansfield. You can all come to our house. And the man from the community renewal team in Hartford, Connecticut said, make sure you have Jack Daniels there. I said, what community action agency is he with? I never heard, if you asked me about Manischewitz wine or something, I could tell you. But that was a learning experience for me. I didn't know anything about Jack, about that at all. So it was trying to see what made a difference in their lives. And of course, you wouldn't be allowed in public buildings to have Jack Daniels, but you would have it in our home. So I think it's also, can we walk in somebody else's shoes? Do we know what it's like for someone, especially now? I think about where we are in 2021 or even 2020. Do we know how to relate to other people's problems?
Hi. Can I help you?
Yeah. Is that a revelation for your students also, Simon? I mean, is it sort of a light bulb moment? Does something click and they suddenly understand, or do they take this for granted, that kind of connection?
I certainly think that, I teach mostly seniors in high school, right? So they're 17, 18 years old. They're sort of coming out of the deepest sort of, part of the adolescent experience and into young adulthood. And I do think it's a wonderful time to sort of catch them as they are starting to sort of, turn their gaze, I think, from what has been a lot of inward sort of development of adolescence to a wider world and thinking about who they are and their role in it. So presenting them with these opportunities to appreciate the lives, like Elsie said, to sort of walk in the shoes of someone else who might seem like it was a long time ago and very, very far away, but through these stories, and I think I love the film because we hear the stories of the survivors, maybe not in their words, but I try in my course to bring in as much as possible, testimony from Holocaust survivors, that as they learn these stories and understand these people as understand the suffering, but also the small victories and joys that they had as well, that they're able to connect with their lives, even though they are so far away and so distant. And like I said, try to sort of build that connection and that empathy that I think is critical to bring into their lives today, as citizens sort of emerging into the world. That's what's powerful to me.
Now, I thought about the distance question too, because one of the people, I was a little bit taken aback. One of the people in the film is saying, in the 70s, World War II seemed like ancient history. That was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Subtract 25 from 2021, and where does that bring you? It's very hard to imagine, I think, how close the war was in time, even though the world had changed a lot very rapidly. And so now it must be even more distant. And did the students also react differently in recent years as questions of racism and immigrant sentiment grew?
That's the other thing. Yeah, absolutely. I think they see, as I do, as we can't help but sort of see that in some ways this history has come so much closer to us in the last few years, and even in the last few weeks. I feel like when I used to teach this course, I used to feel like I had to really work, it wasn't necessarily hard to do, but I had to do, it was some effort to sort of, draw the parallels and find the significance in the stories of the Holocaust to people's lives today, especially around the themes of sort of authoritarianism and the dangers of totalitarianism. Now I feel like we're just living it, right? This history has sort of come to us in ways that it never did before, and I think kids see that, kids feel that, and it's brought an energy to the course and to these topics that haven't necessarily been there, or that maybe I had to work a little harder to bring to the classroom in the past.
That's fascinating too, because of the moment in a different way, that we've been talking for several years now, maybe a decade, about the passage of the Holocaust from lived memory to history, in capital letters, as the survivors die off. So it's all the more important to get these stories recorded while they can still talk and be preserved here in this film is a wonderful achievement. I think with that, though, it's been a fascinating conversation, but we would probably want to wrap things up. And thank you very much for your participation, and remind the audience that there'll be more to come as we take on the question of the Partisans, who are a particular survivor group here, and as this curriculum is developed and rolled out for the wider audience. So once again, we thank you, and we'll just note that this program is being screened on January 27th, which is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was a date that was accepted by the international community because it celebrates the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in January 1945. And so once again, thank you very much, and thanks to Amherst Media, and thanks to our audience.
I want to thank our panelists for their thoughtful insights and expansion of the documentary's issues. Amherst Media will be hosting the premiere showing of the additional footage of the Partisans, along with further discussion on the high school curriculum. Whether we will be able to do that with a live audience will depend on the status of the pandemic, but if not, we hope to have the capacity for questions and answers online. To ensure you have ample time to schedule these events in your calendar, please sign up for our newsletter. Contact us at info@amherstmedia.org. By participating, you are helping Amherst Media deepen the understanding of local and global issues by promoting civil discourse while respecting the rights to free speech for all people. Good night, and please stay healthy and safe.